Hey guys, I'm Annie2 Designs, and today I'm going to be discussing something that I've been asked about a few times over on my social media. So over the past few years, I've gotten several questions regarding how do I start to learn to sew? And some people just have no idea where to even begin thinking of how to learn. So I'm making a handy little guide here for you guys so you can figure out ways to learn for yourselves. So first and foremost, the best way to learn is to actually find someone that will actually give you lessons one-on-one or one with a class. So the reason I say this is because I don't have, through one little video, I can't teach you the fundamentals of how to sew everything. There's a lot of different things that go into sewing. We'd be here for hours. So the best thing that one can do is see if they can find lessons that are local to them. Personally, where I come from, we don't have sewing classes in our high schools anymore, which is very unfortunate, but our local stores, our sewing store back at home offers lessons. So anyone who's from my hometown would be very fortunate to have that resource if they want to learn how to sew. As far as I know, many other towns, cities, etc. also usually have someone out there, a company, something like that, who offers sewing lessons for a pretty reasonable price, usually a few around a month sort of thing, maybe on a weekend or a weeknight, and continuous for a little while where you get to work on one project. Usually these kind of lessons will teach you the basics of fabric cutting, as well as selecting fabric and even showing you how to read a commercial pattern. That actually brings me to my second tip, and that is utilize commercial patterns to their fullest. Nowadays, cosplayers are super lucky because major commercial pattern companies like McCall's and Simplicity actually have a lot of patterns tailored for cosplayers out there. People like Yaya Han and Angela Clayton have put out a lot of commercial patterns for all sorts of different looking outfits, which is absolutely fantastic. And most of these outfits are not made to look just one way. They have instructions on how to actually mix and match pieces so you can have a certain look to the final outfit that you're making. This is absolutely fantastic. This kind of resource did not exist back when people started cosplaying. So we're very lucky in this day and age to have these pattern companies putting out these costume patterns. And then sometimes you're really lucky and you find out they made a pattern of the exact character you're trying to make, and it just works out very perfectly. Now, the best part about these patterns is they usually have pretty in-depth instructions. McCall's and Simplicity are very good at putting step-by-step instructions in there. So combine that with a class or having someone teach you, like your mother or grandmother or something like that, you can easily figure out your way to get through all of these different steps patterns give you. So I'm talking about the different steps that a pattern tells you to follow, or people giving you lessons. Another good way if you're trying to learn something extremely specific and the pattern doesn't mention it, or your lessons didn't teach it to you, or your mother, grandmother, aunt, they don't know how to do it either. We are in the day and age of online resources and tutorials. If it's a thing that people can do, people have probably done it, and other cosplayers have put out a lot of different content, how to do very specific things for sewing, even crafting, things like that. Another great thing is there's all sorts of really good sewing resources out there. Personally, one I really like to use is the Reader's Digest sewing guide. This is one that we actually used when I went to school for fashion and costuming. It was the #1 suggested resource for sewing things. So there are all sorts of resources out there, all sorts of books, all sorts of blogs, vlogs, etc. So if you're trying to figure out a specific skill, there's probably a book on it, for example. So do some research, learn as you go kind of thing. Something that's really good to do when you're starting to learn how to sew is to look at already made garments. Maybe stuff you have already in your closet or things you see at a thrift store that are similar to the garment you want to make. Look at them up close and see how they're made, and you'll start to figure out things on your own in a sense. Sewing is definitely a big, kind of like a puzzle solving skill. There is a lot of problem solving involved in it. So sometimes you look at something, you have to look at a physical garment you already have to figure out how to do something. I do that all the time. For example, the shirt you're seeing over here, I looked at Sam's actual shirt and how to do that. I have a whole video on how I did that particular shirt. Another great thing to do when you're learning how to sew is to start off by altering garments that are similar enough that just need a little change. That way there you're putting some skills in without starting from scratch, which can be very intimidating for someone who is new to sewing for cosplay. So when you're starting to sew your own projects from scratch, something I would recommend to do is to start small. Do not start with bigger projects, with bigger intimidating projects. Almost everyone when they start, they want to do this big fancy character in a huge ball gown or this corseted fairy with beautiful long skirt and whatever it is. I would not recommend doing those projects as a first project. Typically, it is easier to start with something smaller, something not as fitted. The less seams, the better. And some of the patterns, luckily from Commercial Patterns, actually do have level of how easy it is already marked on the package or how many seams are on them sometimes. So do keep that in mind when you're starting to think of a project. I've heard of the piece rule where you want to have as few pieces as possible for one cosplay. So think of that like this for sewing, the seams rule. The fewer seams there are, typically the easier it is. But typically, the simpler the garment, the easier it will be to sew for you. So start with simpler projects instead of projects that have so many seams and so many fitting lines and so many different detailed style lines that it just becomes a little overwhelming. Because it becomes overwhelming, and for a first project, you don't want to be overwhelmed with it. Another thing I would suggest when picking your first project would be to start with garments that are not super fitted. Corsets, ball gown bodices, like a fitted men's vest, any of those usually have extra lines, darts, sewing lines, things like that, because it's meant to fit a very specific way. So if you start with garments like, say, Lake's tunic, for example, that doesn't have any fitting lines and has very few seams. So something else that needs to be considered when you're starting to learn to sew for cosplay is how to choose your fabric. So this can be a really big aspect because the fabric can make and break your project and your budget. So the first thing I would suggest is for a first project, do not go and overspend and spend a lot of money on a really, really expensive fabric. Not a good idea just in case you make some mistakes, which happen. That's just human nature. You're gonna make some mistakes once in a while. So I would highly recommend picking fabrics that are not super expensive for a first project. Now, something else to keep in mind though, while you don't wanna use super expensive fabrics, you don't wanna use cheaply made fabrics, like the costume fabrics that some places try to sell. The costume satin that you just poke it and all of it pulls and just doesn't look that great. I would highly suggest not using fabrics like that because not only do they not look as good as they could, but they're very hard to use, so there's really no benefit except for the fact that they're usually pretty cheap. I would highly recommend using something that costs a few dollars extra per yard or meter just for the extra ease of it working a little nicer. There is a common misconception amongst cosplayers that starting to learn to sew with stretch knit fabrics is a lot easier, but that is not the case, unless you already have all the equipment to sew with a stretch knit. This misconception has happened because typically stretch knit garments have fewer seams and fewer fitting lines because the stretch does all the fitting for you. While that is the case, the fact that it is harder to sew on a standard machine kind of outweighs the fact that it's a simpler garment to sew. So I would definitely recommend starting with woven fabric. To display the difference between woven and stretch, I'll show you first a woven shirt. This is one of my boyfriend's nice button-up shirts, but you will notice it's not really stretching at all. There's a little bit of give there, but that's probably just the fiber, it's not the fabric itself. It's not stretching. Compared to something like my shirt here, is extremely stretchy. This, when you sew with a normal seam down your regular sewing machine, when you pull like this, all the stitches would just come out completely. Now, not all stretch fabrics are quite this stretchy. That is just an example of, I guess, two different extremes. I just wanted to give you guys a bit of a visual so you can get an idea. So we've talked about picking your project and we've talked about the fabric that you might be able to use for it, but now we have to talk about your machines and your tools. So the thing about machines is they can be pretty expensive sometimes, but the cost of the machine doesn't make the sewer, in my opinion. You don't have to have the highest quality $600 machine. You don't have to have that to make a nice costume. Yes, it'll be a little easier and run a bit smoother if it's a bit more expensive, but I digress. Now, if you are in the market for machines, online is a great way to do some research on what kind of machine will suit you. Or if you're as lucky as I am, again, we have our local store, Giroux Sewing Center, which isn't just a fabric store, but also has a whole section of machines. So if you are actually local to Eastern Ontario, Western Quebec, I would highly recommend checking out Giroux Sewing Center if you're looking to get into sewing and buying your own machine. They are the ultimate resource for sewing machines and can even fix them, etc. So definitely look them up. The other thing with sewing machines is everyone is different from each other. So when you go to lessons, for example, they might have a different machine from yours, and they're going to probably suggest that you practice on theirs a little bit to get used to it. The same goes when you start using your own machine. You're gonna wanna start practicing. Don't get it out of the box, get it set up, and then, okay, it's time to start sewing on this brand new fabric I just bought for my new project and go. I would highly suggest cutting a scrap piece of that fabric and starting to just get used to how it goes through the machine. There's all these little knobs and screws, and unfortunately, I'm not probably the best person or resource to tell you how to adjust all the little bits on your machine, because again, every machine is different, has its own little quirks to it. But if you have to start adjusting things, look at your manual, look at online resources. Most machines do have an online resource nowadays, which is great. And figure out how to get it set up so it's sewing nice and straight without the bobbin thread doing all sorts of bobbin art, because you don't want that. You want nice straight seams. Like the sewing machine, your tools do not need to be super high-end nor expensive, as with the fabric as well. So the tools, while you don't want to use your craft scissors on your fabric, for example, and I would recommend using fabric scissors, you don't need a $100 pair of tailoring shears. You can get away with a much cheaper budget version of them, and they'll work just as good as long as you keep them nice and sharp. Most fabric stores like Fabricland do sell a variation of fabric shears for a good price. Same goes for many other tools. You don't need a lot of tools to do a good costume though. Most people accumulate their different tools and different things like that throughout the years of sewing and cosplaying. You don't need a lot to do a good job. It's how you use the tools, not the tools you're using. As long as you're using the tools in the intended way and you're trying your best, you're probably gonna end up doing a good job. It's not about the tools, it's about the person using them. And my last little bit of advice, honestly, is to practice to your heart's content. You're not probably gonna be very good at sewing on your first project. You're gonna need to practice using your machine, your different tools. You're gonna have to practice every time you use a different kind of fabric, because they all behave in very different ways. You might start with a smaller project. With every project, you might learn something new on it. And then suddenly one day you're making a big sewing project with all these techniques you've learned through practicing on smaller costumes. It's all about practice. You're allowed to work at your own pace. Don't let anyone shame you for taking a day to work on something that someone else would take an hour. These are my basic tips on when you're trying to learn to sew for cosplay. I really want to focus on when you're initially trying to learn or trying to figure out how to learn. We're in a day and age when there's all sorts of resources, so you're really in luck if you are trying to learn how to sew right now. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope this video was a little bit useful for those who are trying to learn how to sew for their own costumes. I will see you in the next video, and make sure to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And yeah, thanks for watching, you guys.